Okay, today I want to talk about a really common picking error, particularly with alternate picking, that I see a lot on the internet and I see a lot of my students doing, and I have to correct it quite quickly. And that is overuse of the thumb when it comes to any kind of picking pattern or alternate picked system on the guitar. A lot of people seem to think that it's okay to try and move the thumb about while you're playing, and there's a lot of back and forth as to whether or not this is a good idea. In my particular opinion, I think this is going to really slow down your progress on the instrument. And there's a couple of reasons why, which I'll get into in this video. So first things first, most of the time, if you're moving the thumb about like this, it means that you're increasing the tension in the hand as you're trying to play. And a lot of people do it on string changes, so they might do it something like this, where they have a pattern like this. And in order to get that second note on the E string, they might like try and push the thumb down to kind of get that, something like that, to try and push the pick in the right direction. Or on the way back up, they sometimes turn the thumb like this to try and get the pick over the string to come back over that outside string change. Now, that becomes a bit of a problem at speed because I don't know if you've ever tried this, but try moving the tip of your thumb at like any kind of relative speed on its own. I don't know about you, but I can't do this at all. It just, as soon as I get past about this speed, it's not going to happen and I start engaging the whole thumb. That becomes a problem because then at speed, that's what you're doing. You're engaging this big gripping part here into your fingers, which makes that a lot more tense. It makes it a little bit more inaccurate, and you can't get these fine motions that you might think look good at a slow speed at a much higher speed. So that's one reason why that often trips people up. Yes, there are a few people who do this, but most of the time that's going to trip you up. The other reason why this thumb motion is bad is because we don't really want to have more than one thing moving at a time. The wrist should be doing this up and down and covering the motion of the pick stroke nearly in its entirety, and anything else we want to eliminate as much as possible. A good analogy here is think about writing with a pen. A lot of the time when you're doing that, you don't really want to be having, let's say, the arm up, not resting on something, and then using your elbow while using your wrist, and then while using the end of the fingers to write anything in fine detail. If you use all of these motions at once, quite often you'll find that your handwriting becomes completely illegible, or if you're drawing or something like that or painting, it's incredibly hard to get a neat line, and you have to sometimes lock out parts of the arm to get things to be completely accurate. So a good example of this is if you want to paint a straight line, quite often you might try and like lock the fingers and lock the wrist, and then just move back and forth from the shoulder like this, and that stops all of this motion from getting in the way. That kind of train of thought is very prominent on the guitar as well, where if I'm picking from the wrist and I want everything to be a wrist motion, if I start moving around and messing around with the thumb, I'm effectively training my brain to try and do two motions simultaneously. And while it's not quite as simplistic as saying, oh, that's going to take me twice as long to learn, that sort of principle does apply. It takes you much longer to try and get to grips with using multiple motions at once and multiple different muscles in different parts of the hand, as opposed to just using the one from the wrist. So a couple of things to practice that I think are really important, and also brings me on to another topic, which is the benefit of playing and practicing slow. Are to take some of these patterns. Let's say we take this one. What was it I was doing? And just make sure that when you do this motion to try and get over that E string, that is nearly all wrist. And the upstroke as well, check that that's not doing this, there's no thumb motion in there. No change in the pick grip, no extra kind of movements in this thumb, keep the thumb super relaxed. And even at a medium tempo like that, and we're trying to do those same exercises, you've got to try and do the same thing. Try and make sure there's no discrepancy between that slow speed and that medium speed of starting to engage the thumb in a weird way. And if there is, just go back to the slow speed and really get it into your head what this feels like. And just be able to do that, and hopefully you can hear my pick attack's not super hard here. I'm playing nice and softly, trying to get that control built into the wrist to be able to do some of these string changes without needing to necessarily tense up the hand and try and jump over strings with loads of aggression. It's a little bit more difficult to do that kind of thing, but it really makes a lot of difference to your picking technique. I'm going to show you another example of where this often comes in. And with the economy picking side of things, there are some examples where sometimes thumb motion actually does make a lot of sense. There's a lot of great economy pickers who actually use a fair bit of this. But to show you one where it maybe does trip you up a lot is if you take something like a classic Eric Johnson lick, something like this. What I normally see people doing is this. And they try and like push the thumb through the strings through this way and turn that thumb into the guitar and tense their grip as they're trying to do that economy picked motion. Instead, hopefully you can see, like, when I'm trying to practice that, I'm trying my best not to tense up on that stroke going through two strings, because that's not going to do me any favours. That's going to slow down my technique and also make it really inaccurate, because you're going to apply slightly different pressure each time on a slightly different part of the pick. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't, sometimes you get stuck. Whereas if you get used to just using the wrist, you get much more consistency with it, regardless of what dynamics I'm using and what tempo I'm playing at. So in that particular case, that thumb motion is going to do you, again, no favours if you're trying to play a bunch of Eric Johnson stuff that isn't suited for using that thumb motion. So hopefully this gives you a few different ideas as to where we can use this and where it's best to try and apply just wrist motion and getting used to that. Now, as with everything, some people might say, oh, well, maybe I want to hold the pick a little bit tighter, etc., etc. The final point on this is that it's much, much easier to introduce any extra tension after you've learnt the technique properly than it is to get rid of it in the first place. A good example here would be something like learning how to throw a decent punch. Most people will have to learn how to really slow down that motion and make it really efficient, and make sure they're not like leading too hard with the shoulder, and they're not, desyncing their hips and their arm and all this kind of stuff, and learn how to do that really slowly so that it all connects at once with a lot of power. And then when you speed it up and you add the force in there, it's much easier to add it after you've got the technique right. And exactly the same thing goes on here. If I want to then dig in after this, it's not too hard to dig in once I've got the technique correct. But if I'm really tense to start with and I'm using all of these weird motions initially, they might be hamstringing my playing because they're not efficient and the overall technique is bad before I've even started thinking about whether or not I want to dig in or whether or not these things actually apply here. So that's my main piece of recommendation there, is don't try and force things too quickly. Get used to the technique at a medium tempo, at a very controlled, relaxed speed, and then you try and keep that relaxed control at the higher speeds. But if you've dialed it in at those slower speeds, you should be able to speed it up without changing your technique too much. Obviously it does involve some slightly different muscles at high speeds, but it's still roughly the same principle of doing things. So try all of that and try and make sure that you are not overusing the thumb in any of your alternate picking playing in particular, and hopefully that will help you just become a better alternate picker. If you have any questions, put them in the comments.